Professor Hope Harrison, thank you very much for coming to UNC Chapel Hill. Thank you very much for talking to us in the Krasno event series. You talked to us about the Berlin Wall, first about the building of the wall and the consequences, then about the consequences of the fall of the wall 30 years ago in 1989. How did the West view the building of the wall in the early 1960s? Was that seen as a calamity and a great disaster, or was it also seen differently?
First, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful series. The West saw the wall in two different ways. On the one hand, it saw it as morally repugnant, walling in the citizens of East Germany, not letting them leave the country. And also saw it as recognition of the weakness of the communist regime, that the only way East Germany could survive was making sure its citizens couldn't leave. On the other hand, what led up to that was a massive refugee exodus of over 1,000 East Germans fleeing to the West every day. And President Kennedy and others were worried. Where is this going to go? Are the Soviets going to ultimately get involved militarily and somehow stop this? And are the West Germans, who are now members of NATO, going to demand that NATO get involved and help the Germans? So there was always a fear that developments in Berlin could turn into World War III. So that's why President Kennedy said privately to his aide after the East Germans sealed the border, he said, a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. So he was relieved that it seemed the crisis was resolved by, in a sad way for the East Germans and the German nation, by forcibly separating them.
So was it almost inevitable that something like a wall would be built to perhaps save world peace?
I can't go so far as to say to save world peace, especially because that's what the former communist East German leaders say to this day. And I can't go that far. It saved themselves, that's for sure. I mean, and that was the main reason for it. And certainly stabilized the situation at the time.
When you look back at the time, at the situation and the circumstances at the time, could politicians in West and East have thought of a better solution to stabilize the situation without building a wall?
Well, the interesting thing is, though, that the Soviets and the East Germans thought the West would respond, which really makes me wonder, might they have backed down? And it wouldn't have been a war. The East German leader, Walter Ulbricht, wrote to Khrushchev in Moscow saying the enemy took fewer countermeasures than anticipated. So they really thought the West, and particularly the US, was going to do something, which is why they just started with barbed wire, thinking if the West tears down the barbed wire, then maybe we won't do this. But the West didn't do anything. So that, to me, really leaves open the question, might we have, in fact, been able to stop it short of war?
Thank you. When we jump forward a little bit, look at the present situation in Germany, particularly in East Germany, and then one wonders whether the country is still mentally divided into East and West, at least to some extent. So do you think that the wall has had long-lasting repercussions well beyond 1989 when it came down?
It's interesting, Klaus, because in the 1990s, in the first few years after the wall came down, there was much talk about the wall in the minds, Mauer im Kopf, that East Germans and West Germans felt very different. They hadn't expected that, but suddenly they realized that 40 years of growing up in different systems and thinking differently and dressing differently and having different senses of humor, all of that turned out to be more differences than they thought. And so they talked about the wall in the mind. And that went away for quite a while. It went away for about 15 years. From a lot of public discussion, and now it is suddenly back, and it's visible in elections. the parties in the East are different than the parties in the West in terms of the majority of who's voting for them. And certainly the far-right party, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, is getting much more votes in a much higher percentage of the vote in the East than the West. But absolute numbers are higher in the West. Still, they've got 12% in the parliament. The vast majority of Germans are not supporting them. Even in the West, okay, they came in second in the most recent elections, but, not even, less than a third of people in the former East are voting for them. So it's worrisome, but the majority of Germans are not supporting the far right.
Thank you. But what drives these 12% which you mentioned, both in East and West? What is their motivation to vote for the AfD in view of the past German history, for example?
Yes, I think as so often with this kind of party, it's a protest party. And so they're protesting a sense that their own lives aren't as good as they had hoped for, particularly economically, and feeling they're not being listened to. Certainly people in the former East and some of the more backwards areas where the economy has suffered since unification, those people are angry and frustrated. The really ambitious people and many of the women have moved to the West. They're not staying in the East. And the refugee crisis of 2015 has really fueled this as well, even though there are far fewer refugees in the East. But as always happens, people are the most xenophobic who haven't met many foreigners. And so this particularly anti-Muslim feeling and fear is driving a fair amount of this, and the party is really taking advantage of this and running with it.
What would be your policy advice to the Chancellery if they rang up tomorrow and said, Dr. Harrison, we would like to get the numbers below 5% instead of 12% or more. What can you advise us to do as a matter of urgency? What would you advise them to do?
Well, and in fact, the German government realizes it's urgent, and they are starting to really take measures, I think, starting by listening. There's full recognition now across the government that people in the East are frustrated, and they're talking about this, and they're going into the East. Angela Merkel started a whole new dialogue program in the city of Schwedt in May. Other top German leaders are going elsewhere to find out, these sort of civic forums, talking to citizens, what do you want? What do you need? What is the situation? In what ways do you not feel heard? So, that's a start. But there's also a sense that even though there's long been a solidarity tax on income to put it toward the East, that still more needs to be done. And so there's a lot of talk of the fact that almost no major German industries have headquarters in the East. And so I think they probably need to talk about significant tax breaks to do something so that, big German companies set up shop in the East and employ people there.
That sounds to me like a very good suggestion. Thank you very much for your insight. Thanks for coming here.
Thank you.